I welcome our esteemed panelists for the session on the dais, please. I request our chair and moderator, Mr. Valentin de Miguel, Senior Managing Director, Chief Strategy Officer, and Sustainability Services Lead, Growth Markets, Accenture, to take the lead and moderate the session. Please, sir. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon. As you know, the wish of every speaker who has to speak after lunch is that the audience has drunk a lot of coffee. So hopefully that's the case also today. Welcome to the Ensuring Renewables Energy Transition session. As I was kindly introduced, my name is Valentin de Miguel. I'm going to be the moderator of this panel. And when I'm not moderating panels, I work for Accenture as the Chief Strategy Officer in the growth markets. And it's my pleasure and very honor to share stage today with this set of distinguished and extremely knowledgeable panelists that I cannot wait to introduce. Let me introduce Ms. Gauri Singh, who is the Deputy Director General of IRENA, International Renewable Energy Agency. Mr. Oki Murasa, Senior Vice President for Research and Technology Innovation at Pertamina. Welcome, Pakoki. Mr. Lin Wei Sang, Global Head of Energy, Renewables and Infrastructure at DBS Bank. And Mr. Venkatesh, Managing Director and Director of Energy Business at Varchila. And Mr. Shantanu Haiswal, Head of India Research at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. The structure of this session will be the same as the structure of the previous sessions. So I will be making a short introduction for context, and then I will offer the opportunity to the panelists for them to share their initial inputs and views, and then I will make short questions. And please, apologies in advance if I'm rude enough to remind you of the time, because I've been instructed to time slot the session to 1 hour. Apologies in advance. And then after those questions, time permitting, we may open it up for questions to the audience. So, without any further ado, as a matter of introduction, I would like to cover 3 topics. Firstly, what's the current status of energy transition? Secondly, the importance of emerging and developing economies in the energy transition. And thirdly, specifically on the deployment of renewables globally. So on the topic of where are we on the energy transition journey? Over the last decade, we have made significant strides in transitioning towards low-carbon energy systems. And I think as a testament to that, and it's been already shared, that investments in different types of renewables energy have overtaken investments in fossil fuels. Nowadays, energy and climate policies have taken the center stage of domestic and international affairs. There is a great deal of climate consciousness, which was not here 6 years ago, as has been said earlier on in the audience, due to mounting scientific evidence and so on and so forth. And also the geopolitical balance has somehow shifted, and we have experienced the emergence of new superpowers in the renewables energy component manufacturing and critical minerals, for example. So there is clear momentum on energy transition. However, this momentum has experienced near-term disruptions, as we have experienced in the last 3 years. And we in Accenture have developed a global disruption index. It's a composite that measures economic, social, geopolitical, climate, consumer, technology disruption. And what it tells us is that since 2017 to 2022, macroeconomic volatility has increased by 200%. And this 200% compares to a 4% of increase in macroeconomic volatility from 2011 to 2016. So massive disruption. And this, it has been called already polycrisis before in the, today. This polycrisis has forced countries to reallocate resources in order to address very serious accessibility and affordability constraints. But where are we in the energy transition journey? I think it's worth looking at the Energy Transition Index that the World Economic Forum has developed with the humble support of Accenture as well. And it's a data-driven framework that benchmarks countries on the basis of, on the one side, the actual performance of the energy systems, and at the same time, a forward-looking measure of the transition readiness. And what it tells us in the last 2023 report that has been just recently released is that for the last decade, there has been a constant increase year over year in the Energy Transition Index score. But in the last 3 years, we have experienced a plateau. And this is because out of the 3 dimensions of the energy triangle, well, sustainability has increased very significantly. Governments have put a lot of focus in energy security, but the equity and inclusiveness has been severely hit. And low-income countries have been disproportionately impacted by this due to fuel inflation, food prices inflation, and the increasing burden of debts. And since we are talking about emerging and developing economies, I think it's fair to say that the energy transition battle and probably the entire sustainability battle will be won or lost in the emerging and developing economies. What we see is that with growing populations, growing economies, in places like India, there is going to be an increasing demand for energy. And we have already heard our chief guest that there are unfulfilled chapters of the development agenda that need to be addressed. There is a very legitimate aspiration to improve standards of living. And that has a consequence. As a matter of fact, if you look at the energy consumption per capita, in the developed economies in the last decade, it has been flat. In the emerging and developing economies, energy consumption per capita has increased by almost 20%. So in emerging economies, we have growing population, growing economies, and by the way, this growth has an energy intensity that is much higher than in the developed economies. The volume of energy that we need for every increase in GDP is much higher. And the complication, the additional complication, is that the carbon intensity of the energy mix is much higher in emerging and developing economies. So the challenge is how we cope with that growth, how we decarbonize the energy system with a just and fair transition. And specifically on the renewables deployment, I think it's, again, fair to say that renewables deployment has experienced an exponential growth in the last years. And I think John Moore already indicated that in 2022, renewables investment has reached a record high of more than 1 trillion. That's 18% increase over 2021. And it's 70% more than pre-pandemic levels in 2019. And this is, of course, because of the availability of technology, the reduction in the levelized cost of energy, regulation, you name it. But let me highlight a couple of topics. Firstly, there is an urgent need to boost innovation in places like alternative fuels, in places like hydrogen, in places like carbon capture and sequestration, because those can be and will be critical to achieving net zero in 2050. But secondly, there is an urgent need to strengthen the electricity grid. With more wind and solar, we need a strong grid backbone that can manage asynchronous distributed flows with minimal losses and disruptions. So, in conclusion, I would say that significant strides have been done in the last decade, despite the near-term challenges. But if we continue at the pace that we are implementing today, we are not going to reach the 1.5 degrees in 2050. And anyway, this will require a very significant volume of investments, as has been already indicated. And if we agree that the energy transition will be won or lost in emerging and developing economies, a good part, a very significant part of those investments will have to be made in these economies. And we know that these economies do not have the ability to finance those investments. So what we would need is, amongst many other things, firstly, to make the commitments to channel funnels to developing and emerging economies real. Secondly, concerted actions between private and public institutions. Thirdly, stable regulatory frameworks, and certainly as well, price signals that can make green investment risk-adjusted attractive. So that will be my introduction for the panel. And with that, I would like to invite inputs for the panel on the topic. And I would like to invite Ms. Gauri Singh to provide her inputs, please.
Thanks, Valentin. I think that was a great segue. And thank you to CII for inviting me to share my views. I think what you said is I would say it's true. I do hope that we still have the 7-year window for meeting the 1.5 degree climate goals, and I hope as a world community we can still make it. But what needs to be done is that we have to be looking at tripling the annual additions in renewable energy. We need to be looking very strongly at making efforts on energy efficiency and improving the energy intensity, and that's clearly the way that we have to look at how can this really be done. Now, coming to tripling, now that might sound quite enormous because you're looking at about 300 gigawatts of renewables being deployed in last year, and you're looking at that going to about 900,000 annually. But we need to remember also that there have been historical trends that we've seen over the last decade that make us feel that this is possible. And if in last year, and Valentin spoke about it, if there has been an investment of 1.3 trillion in energy transition technologies, it's been a record high, but that needs to also go to about $4 and $5 trillion. But if you look at the capital flows that we have globally, which are about of the tune annually of about 200 trillion. So it's not as if we don't have the money that can actually flow into these technologies and in this effort. So there's clearly a political will, and for all of you who've been following the G20, you can definitely see that climate and environment is really on top of everyone's agenda. And there are enough wildfires and droughts and all that have clearly brought out the impact much closer to home than people would like to see. So I think, if you look at what is the readiness we have a fairly gung-ho industry which comprises of IPPs, which comprises of manufacturers who have the capacity to take these technologies forward globally, definitely in India. You have a very strong case of renewables being the cheapest source, so there's no question about the economics. It makes economic sense to do it. In developed countries, as you said, it's more about switching from one set of energy fuels to another, but in developing countries, in emerging countries, it's much more about where that incremental comes from, and you're already seeing about 83% of the annual additions coming from renewables globally, so which is again a very strong thing. But what are the challenges that we are facing? I think the first and foremost is that energy transition is no more just about the power sector. I think the power sector will get there. It needs to, by 2050, it needs to be at about 52% of the entire energy mix. It will probably get there. But what about the end users? Other than, you're looking at buildings, you're looking at industry coming on board, you're looking at heating and cooling for countries in the tropical belt. And these are areas where the progress is really slow. So when you're talking about something like energy transition, and you're talking of an economy-wide phenomenon, you have to take all these together in a very concerted, coordinated approach in policy making, in regulations, to make it bigger than what can happen in silos. Transport, of course, is another end use. Second, I think a very big challenge is getting the investment into the infrastructure that's needed for the new energy system. So it's not just adding incrementally to what exists, but it's actually looking at a completely different way of imagining how the infrastructure will be needed. If you're talking green hydrogen, of course, you're talking ports. If you're talking green hydrogen, you're also talking pipelines. But if you're talking also more renewables, variable power into our grid, you're talking of the grids getting strengthened to be able to bring in that from very decentralized locations. So I think infrastructure is something which you need much more investment. It's the invisible part of this whole piece. And finally, I think it goes without saying that obviously the policies and regulations need to be in place to be able to attract, and with long-term visibility, to be able to attract investments. Investments will come in. Right now, in the developing countries, you don't really see investments happening. It's a very small percentage that goes into the developing countries. But if you can create the demand pool and you have the policy and regulations right, investments will come in because there is money that can be spent and it can get moving in this direction. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring reminders about the need to triple end users infrastructure regulation. Thank you. Pak Oki, I'm scared in front of you because you were the policy manager of the task force at B20 Indonesia last year. So you know it all. What's your view on the topic, please?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Valentin. It's good to see you after 1 year of B20 Indonesia in Bali. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I would like to highlight the status basically by emphasizing on 3 blocks. So as you know that the transitions that we have in Indonesia, we are quite similar with India in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of affordability. So we can see it from 3 blocks. The first block is how can we increase the volume of renewable energy. And then the second block is how can we reduce the emission from current business. And then the third block is basically how can we induce, how can we stimulate the low carbon business. So from the first block in which that we are basically increasing the volume of renewables, in Indonesia we are lucky to have geothermal. So now if we see in sustainability, Pertamina is the second in terms of integrity energy company because of the geothermal. So we have own and co-own, we have about 1.2 gigawatt green electricity. And then from this green electricity, basically now we are calculating, we are trying to have the ecosystem for green hydrogen. This is something that we are going to have in the near future. And then the second one is basically variable renewable energy. This is still costly for us because the developers are basically mostly from the West. And what we have at this moment, we are trying to have the solar PV in some of our facilities in order to reduce scope 2. And basically, the third one is basically in which that we are trying to integrate the variable and the base load by having the energy storage, which is basically EV ecosystem plus energy storage ecosystem, the battery. Then the second block that we are currently working is basically we are having a lot of collaborations on CCS and CCUS. This is basically by considering that the common but differentiated role from Kyoto Protocol. So we have a lot of collaboration with the Japan companies, etc., in which that we are studying the CCS and CCUS. We are trying to utilize the CO2, etc. And with this, basically, we can also have the low carbon hydrogen or blue hydrogen. And the third block that we have is basically related to the low carbon and the bioenergy. So we can see that Indonesia is lucky to have enough rain and also basically enough UV light. So biomass is basically kind of energy storage that we have in Indonesia. So from this biomass, either lignocellulose or vegetable oil, we can create the sustainable efficient fuels. We can produce HVO or green diesel, etc. And also we are developing the biogas, biomethane from liquid waste. And then the last one is basically low carbon fuels by utilizing our current infrastructure, learning from the success story of Brazil, in which that they managed to have E27, and in Sao Paulo, I heard that it's E100. So now in Jakarta and Surabaya, two major cities in Java, we started with B5. And the homework, basically, we need to deploy more technologies in which that we can produce bioethanol, low carbon fuels, with a cheaper price, with a more affordable price. And with this, basically, we are covering the four bridge to the energy transitions: capital, infrastructure, technology, and regulatory framework. I hope that with the events that we have now, we can synergize, we can have more collaboration in which that basically the technology costs, financial costs, etc., can be tackled accordingly. Thank you, Valentin.
Thank you, Pak Oki, for the exceptional examples of leading-edge technologies and for reminding us of the global leadership of Indonesian geothermal. And I would like to invite Wisen to provide comments. Wisen, please.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Valentin, and good afternoon to everyone. From a banker or financier's perspective, I'll just kind of like Pak Oki, just put this into 3 frames. The first frame, I call it accelerating the existing. And since I'm in India, I better say something nice about what India has done. From a pan-Asian perspective, actually as a financier, 2 countries stand out in terms of accelerating and really developing its renewables development. And that has been Australia, which is a AAA country, and also India. Now, to be honest, if you look at the stats, China ranks way ahead everyone. But that's of course, a lot of it is led by state-owned enterprises, etc. But in terms of private sector push, India has really been quite transformational in how it has grown its renewable capacity, including hydro, to about 170 gigawatts. And you want to get to 500 gigawatts, or your prime minister says he wants to get to 500 gigawatts by 2030. That's more than double, right? And that pace is amazing. And from a financial perspective, always challenging has been the money is there, right? It's always been about bankable projects. And I think the thing that really transformed in this renewable sector was this, amongst other policies, this setting up of SECI that really took out what we call counterparty risk in investing in projects. And us at DBS, obviously, we deployed quite a bit of capital into India, and we're quite happy with how we've deployed it. I just came back from some business travels to North Asia. I won't name countries, but yeah, they have been asking about how do we get some money to work in India. So it's been quite, in terms of the renewable sector, so it's been quite encouraging in terms of how you have been quite focused in terms of policy, in terms of enabling infrastructure to get this going. Of course, the easy part is the plug and play and the solar farms and the wind farms. I think as you get more renewables into the grid, obviously more sophistication will have to come in, long duration storage, batteries, and other load firming solutions will have to come in. So that in a sense, coupled with where interest rates have gone, unless you have been hiding somewhere, you've known that interest rates have gone north. And that has kind of introduced a bit of speed bumps to investments, especially on the infrastructure fund side of things, right? Because obviously internal rates of return have gone up, right? Especially now you can get US Treasuries for north of 5%. Suddenly an infrastructure investment that was giving you 8-9% last time doesn't look so attractive now. So that's causing a rethink. But I see a silver lining in all that. I think you are seeing a lot more than just financial engineering come into the space. I think you're seeing the strategic investors starting to play ball again. And I think that's quite required for how you want to ensure longevity in terms of the solutions that will continue to drive this energy transition. And indeed, in some of the M&A advisories that we're running, we are indeed seeing the strategic players come in a bit stronger than the funds, because the funds obviously are still kind of recalibrating how they want to play the game in a higher interest rate scenario. So that's what I call the first bucket, which is accelerating the existing. Now, obviously in Asia, especially in Southeast Asia where I come from, I call the second bit decarbonizing the current. What do I mean by that? Now, building renewables is great, but the elephant in the room for us in Southeast Asia is we have a very young coal fleet, coal-fired power plants that are 7 to 12 years old, right? So, and these are 25-year PPAs. So to tell these nations to just write them off and jump onto renewables is quite unthinkable. So we need to solve this elephant in the room. And what we're doing with the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Indonesia, called INA, we're advising them on what we call, I think most of you would have heard of it before, the energy transition mechanism, where we are bringing in blended capital, including philanthropic capital, including funds from the likes of multilaterals like ADB. The idea is, how do we buy over some of these plants and close them down early so that we take out the delta? So if I close down a coal-fired plant earlier by 5 years to 7 years, I do take out CO2 that would have been there if it had gone to full life. So we call this decarbonizing the current. And we think that actually many ASEAN countries and many countries in Asia do struggle with that, largely because of the very inflexible contractual structures we have, where people lock into take or pays for PPA. So we can't ignore the current, what we have. And as you catalyze that, obviously it will drive the need for more renewables, etc. And then the last bit, obviously, I think most of us know, we do have existing technologies that can bring us on this IEA's net zero to 2030, right? The technologies that are existing now can bring us to 2030 as a marker, but from 2030 to 2050, actually a lot of that needs to be new solutions, which are yet to be either commercialized or scaled, right? And these will be the likes of carbon capture, hydrogen, long duration storage. So as an intermediary of capital, not just lending money at the senior debt level, we are increasingly also seeing conversations around especially hydrogen. So Singapore has a hydrogen strategy as well. If you know Singapore, we do not have real estate for renewables. So we either have to import renewables or we have to look to either transportable sources of green energy. And one of them could be hydrogen. We have just financed one of our power companies on a 30% enabled gas-fired power plant that can fire up to 30% hydrogen, right? And with the change of a burner, you can actually bring that up to 100%. So getting ourselves hydrogen ready is the next thing. But we're trying to see how we can intermediate capital. Obviously, for nascent technologies, the capital can't be bank debt. The capital will either be venture or junior or pref sorts of equity structures that are coming in, and we're seeing how we're starting to also see, especially in the space of hydrogen, capital that is quite keen to be put to work in that area. All right, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Wishen. Thanks for highlighting the transformation in India. I love your balance between we cannot ignore what we have today and your comments about the nascent technologies. And when you said the money is there, you reminded me that I'm a happy customer of DBS. Obviously in the retail space, not institutional. So now let me move on to Venkatesh from Varchila, please.
Thank you, Valentine, also for the good introduction. And thank you, CII, for setting up this type of an event here, and which brings also, delegates from different parts of the world, and together with other agencies like the Finnish Chamber and the different chambers in India, we are setting up a good platform. And this is where we can discuss also much more things. And this brings us also to a perspective of bringing different stakeholders in the ecosystem together and build up towards the journey which we have taken. So if we look at the energy transition journey, which we have embarked upon, it's not a 2-year, 5-year type of plan which we used to do. We are talking about some countries looking at 2050, India has put up a 2070 type of a direction. But there, if you would see it, if you look at energy and the power sector, we need to do things much more faster. And as a lead front, we have good ambitions. Government has set up ambitious targets of 500 gigawatt non-fossil fuel type of generation by 2030, which is a very important milestone. If we look at a decade back, what we have done we have reached around 170 gigawatts. And in the recent 5 years, if you would see, we have added around 60, 70 gigawatts. What the next 5-7 years would need would be addition of around 45 to 50 gigawatts every year. And that's important in this renewable energy transition journey, renewable journey which we are in. But when we are doing that, adding renewables, there are also more concerns which will come in with respect to that. Sun is not shining always, the wind is not blowing every time. So when the sun is not there, when wind is not there, there has to be other sources of energy which are able to support. And that supporting mechanism needs to come in from other sources of energy, which can come in. And what we are talking about is not shutting down a plant and starting up another plant. These are sources which will go away within a few seconds. So we need to have technology which will bring in a few seconds, the power back to as it was, and also sometimes it may be not there for a few hours. So we need that few hours technology also. So we need a combination of different systems and solutions in the whole energy systems which will be able to manage this transition. And that is where we need to have flexible, modular solutions. Depending upon what is missing from the system, how can we add that and quickly manage that without any impacts on the overall system. We have seen in this week, again a few weeks before, the spikes are happening. The maximum demand of energy is coming up. And it's going to grow tremendously in the coming years. With the advancement of technology, with the advancement of usage of more electricity, more and more things are going towards demand of electricity going high. So what we have to do is we have to balance out also that this energy is also maintained and sustained well in this changed environment. If you're doing that, there are also fuels which we need to also develop, which will also be more greener in future. Today they are costly, today it is also needed for other purposes, but when we add renewables, they would become more affordable and they would be then used for also in the energy sector. For example, hydrogen would be used and other similar biofuels will be used, which will help us also to reach towards that greener direction. But for today, we need a balance of these type of solutions which are more modular, flexible, and guiding that. What we have seen is also that this type of solutions, we think that it will cost a lot and overall ecosystem will be very costly. We have done modeling studies around 150 plus countries and also have done specific studies on India. And what it reveals is that when we have the right solutions, the right mix of solutions for the purpose, the total cost of solution would even be 40 to 45% cheaper. That's what the studies are coming up, and that is also validated by different specialist reports, which are global reports which are available, and all are aiming towards that direction. So in this journey, what is important is to enable an ecosystem and bring up that perspective of a joint energy source which is available as a portfolio, and they need to be forecasted and utilized well in the system. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I love your comment about the contribution needed for different systems and solutions, and thanks for reminding us the size of the effort moving forward. And now moving to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Shantanu, your comments, please.
Thank you, Valentin. Thank you, Valentin. And first of all, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and to CII for giving me this opportunity. I have very similar thoughts to what has been mentioned by other panelists over here, but maybe a slightly different way of looking at it. And in my mind, the whole energy transition journey for the past few years has been a big roller coaster ride. I mean, if you look at it right now, 90% of all emissions are under some form of legislation or government discussion. In January 2020, it was about 33%. In January 2022, it moved from 33 to 90%. But 22 and 23, there has been very little that has happened. So stabilization of what you mentioned is coming up in some sense, at least in terms of climate discussions. Not a lot of countries have moved towards legislating climate goals or net zero targets. But if you look at the investment side, which was also pointed out, we invested globally $1.1 trillion were invested in energy transition industries, which is equivalent to the total investments in the fossil fuel industry. So the first time in 2022, total energy transition industries equaled that of fossil fuels, and it also crossed $1 trillion. But the idea should not be that we have done it. The idea should be that $1 trillion should be the base going forward every year and not the ceiling. And good things are happening. For example, I was just looking at some of our numbers, and in 1H of 23, we have actually done roughly around $360 billion worth of financing in renewables alone. Last year it was 500 total. This year it is 360 already. So we have done 72% of what we did last year. So we are on a growth trajectory. But if you look at where most of these investments are being made, so in 2022, 75 to 80% of these investments were being made in developed countries, and I'm including China in developed category. So there is a big difference between where the money is flowing and where the importance or where the needs are at this moment. Then if you talk about, whole global climate change, we are past a point where we might restrict the global rise in temperatures to 1.5 degrees centigrade. It doesn't seem like it's going to be possible. So our next best bet is to be somewhere close to 1.7, 1.75. But in order to do that, we need to scale up a lot of things. We need to do a lot of things. We need to massively scale up deployment of renewables. We are publishing a report in 2 days' time. We're looking at what India should do to achieve net zero by 2050. And one of the conclusions is that on an average, between now and 2050, we need to build 148 gigawatts of wind and solar capacity or renewables capacity. This is, by the way, equal to the installed capacity, total grid installed capacity of Canada in 2021. So we need to build one Canada equivalent every year in India up until now, from now till 2050. We also need to think about how do we reduce emissions from the coal sector. We need to invest in having a robust supply chain, because India will produce about 17 to 18% of the world's cement and steel in 2050, as per our calculations. India will also need so many, as I mentioned, multi-gigawatts and terawatts of wind and solar capacity. So we cannot afford to have any supply disruption because the space of development of wind and solar is at a breakneck speed. Finally, something else was pointed out is that we also need to invest in or develop newer technologies. And my two picks would be, again, hydrogen and CCS plus CCUS. Hydrogen, because it is one of the technologies that can help us lower emissions in hard-to-abate sectors such as steel. And what we also figure out is that hydrogen could act as a source of flexible demand. So when there is surplus of solar or wind and there is no demand, flexible hydrogen electrolyzers can actually come up and be a source of demand-side management. But hydrogen has its limitations, and that is where we see CCS plays an important role. For example, technologies such as, or industries such as cements, we don't see, at least in India, hydrogen playing a big role because of the economics. But CCS can play an important role. Our study says that more than 50% of emissions abatement in the cement sector can happen via CCS. So, yeah, we need to do quite a lot of things in order to get things on track.
Thanks very much. Thank you for your insightful comments on the investments, the need to scale up, and the new technologies. So now I'm going to start a quick round of Q&A with each of you. And Gauri, hopefully you don't mind that I start with you. And I know that I talk on behalf of many in the audience at Beyond when I praise your advocacy for women's role in the energy transition. So firstly, thanks very much for being so vocal about it. And secondly, could you please elaborate on that?
Thanks, Valentin. I think, this is naturally a topic that when you talk about equity and inclusivity, then you cannot but be talking also about the role that women can play in the energy transition. And, being half the population, it definitely needs to have a very strong role in it. The good thing is that the new energy system is much more amenable to women participating at all levels, which is to say that, the traditional energy system that we've all seen is these centralized large thermal plants or, which make it a very forbidding kind of a place for women to work in. But the new energy system, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, is much more, I would say, because of its decentralized nature and the way that it has developed, much more inclusive, and which is why you do see almost in the solar sector, you see PV sector, you see almost 40% of women participation, which is great. And then you normally, you feel good about renewables having about 32% women participation, because you're comparing it with the oil and gas sector, which has about 22. But I think my take on this is, why even compare it with oil and gas? I mean, that's not the comparison that we need to do. We need to be looking at moving beyond looking at the old, old energy systems. And I think the key thought that I want to leave the audience with is about the intentionality. It will not happen if there's no intention to get in more participation of women, because it's not as if you don't have women who have the STEM, who are in the STEM sector, who are in the finance sector, but it's about the intentionality with which you actually pursue this, whether at the government level, at the policy level, at the, at the industry level. It just needs to be there. And I just want to leave with an example that I think everyone here would be familiar with, is when it got introduced that you have to have a woman director at the board of all public listed companies, it started happening. And I don't want to go to, energy conferences where, there's just a sprinkling of women there. I want to go to energy conferences and to meetings like this where, I see many more women being engaged in this sector.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Gauri. Pakoki, I know you have been deeply involved in many research and technology innovation for many, many years. And to be honest, I can't wait to hear your view on things like biofuels or hydrogen.
Thank you, Valentin. So the critical part that we need to have basically when we are deploying technologies is basically we need to start something. We need to start with the ecosystems. In Indonesia, we have a very nice success story where we started the biodiesel with 2.5%, 5%. And this year, the government announced that we are going to have 35%. So biodiesel 35% in our energy mixture. I think this is the largest so far on Earth. So by learning from this biodiesel story, basically now we are trying to do similar things with the ethanol. We start with the 5% in Jakarta and Surabaya. And then by learning from this, we are starting the hydrogen from 120 megawatt in North Sulawesi. And then by learning from this, we start to have the injection of CO2 for CCUS, and later we are going to dip on the CCS. So basically, as part of the developing countries, most of the technologies are not with us, basically. We have a cost of technology, and then like Mr. Wiseng mentioned that we have also cost of capital, which is also burning our developments. And basically, we need to pick the certain technology in which that we still have the economic growth in such a way that we can tackle the emissions, we can move along the energy transition, but at the same time, we keep our economic growth. Thank you, Valentin.
Thank you, Pakoki. Wiseng, coming from DBS, I would love if you could please connect two of the topics that are popping up continuously in these conversations, which is on the one side, the need for public and private sectors to cooperate, and on the other side, financing of investments, please.
Okay. I think those of us who have been in the traditional infrastructure space, you would have heard of PPPs for a long time, public-private partnership. I think it's taken on an additional angle of what we call blended finance, right? Increasingly in terms of hopefully blending public sector money or even multilateral money to lower cost of capital to push especially some of these more nascent technologies for which we need to cover the delta beyond renewables. So, like I said, for the energy transition mechanism, we saw philanthropic capital, and we had very interesting conversations with them, because when we said that, hey, if your money comes in with some other forms of public debt, it blends it to, let's say, for illustrative purposes, the returns would be 8%. We actually had a question where they asked, if we lower our returns to 6%, can you close it down earlier? Right, so that I've never seen before, right? Maybe it's the people I mix with or something, but I've never seen that sort of question before, where if I lower my returns, can you close it instead of 5 years, can you do 7 or 10 years? Right? And their KPI, obviously, beyond financial, is impact. So is there more of that? I don't know. I know that for a long time in our sector, especially in Asia, one of the biggest enablers of long-term financing, especially in developing economies, have been not so much the multilaterals, although there's been a lot of encouragement now for the multilaterals to step up, World Bank Group, etc. The biggest movers and shakers in project finance, in power in particular, in the old days, has been what we call the export credit agencies, the ECAs, right? So some of you in the room, or most of you in the room, would have heard of names like JBIC, Kexim. In China, it would be Sinosure, etc. So when renewables happen, I have not seen as much activity from them, largely because export credit agencies by nature are driven by either investments from their country or equipment that is sold by their country. So, and obviously you know a lot of these solar, etc., a lot of this was from China, not Japan or Korea. But recently we have seen encouraging signs where they are willing to consider low-cost debt where there is a green element, right? Honestly, still work in progress, but I'm encouraged by that momentum because that's even more required now given where interest rates have gone, right? I think where interest rates have gone has really dented the storyline around what you call. My point has always been, if you look at how renewables even took off in the West, it was this thing called feed-in tariffs. So when things have not yet hit a certain scale, you need kind of public sector or, I hate to use the word, but I'll use it, subsidies to kind of give it a leg up for it to hit an inflection point where it can then take off, right? So that was happening quite nicely for quite a few things in the past 2 years before this, right? But since that inflationary cycle that we have gone into and where rates have gone, that's taken a bit out of the wind out of the sails, out of that. So I think if it's higher for longer, and we think it may be higher for longer, unfortunately, then we probably need a bigger push from blended capital, and we really need public sector creativity. And obviously, us from the private sector, we're more than happy to see how we can aggregate and intermediate that flow and come up with structures. Okay. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Vishen. Venkat, since you mentioned the word ecosystem, and in 2 minutes, I would appreciate your comments about, because it literally takes a village. But what would be your comment on the ecosystem in energy transition?
Yeah, I touched upon the journey which we are in, and the journey is not, inclusive of one entity or the other entity. It needs already, Wee Seng San was mentioning about the participation of public, private, and so this type of ecosystem. What I mean is, we need to have industries participating together with governmental agencies and also the private public financings, which has to come in to support this journey which we have taken in. And this ecosystem, surely, one of the other elements which I want to touch upon the ecosystem is also the different sources which I indicated. And sources, when I indicate, also needs to develop in that same scenario. So for example, when we talk about fuels which are going to be non-fossil, it has to come in also. So the development for hydrogen, development for methanol, development for ammonia is already ongoing in the development. So R&D is a very key component in this ecosystem also. And there maybe developing countries has to depend more on the developed countries. So for example, Europe, Americas, who are spending a lot of efforts on R&D, what we should do is spend those learnings, take those quickly, and then utilize them into the system. For example, we as a company have developed hydrogen engines which can run already on a 25% blend. We have already 100% ammonia solutions ready. So similar type of solutions for India to take it can be an easy route which you can adopt. So that's the ecosystem which I was mentioning. And today, with this type of engagement and the collaboration which we are having, and especially on the G20 as a backbone and the B20 engagement which we are getting in, we should utilize these complementing factors and then rocket. Rather than just leapfrogging, I would say we have to pole vault, towards that. That's the direction which we have to set up to reach towards the ambitious target which we are having in.
Thank you, Venka. And Shantanu, the final question for you. And since Bloomberg New Energy Finance has this global view and you have this India responsibility, what will be your one lesson learned from the global view for the India model?
Well, I guess instead of saying one lesson learned, what I figured what is needed in India is access to financing, access to capital. Because more so in our country, because if you look at any developed country, let's say, for example, US, if the government pushes a policy, financing automatically flows in that direction. But in India, if we create a policy, the first question that comes to everybody's mind is, where is the money going to come from? And I'm saying this because, again, if we are to achieve net zero, then our numbers show that we'll need $12.7 trillion in the next 30 years to have an energy transition in India. And that's a huge amount, almost like $440 billion per year. If you extrapolate that till 2070, which is when our net zero target is, then you still need about $230 billion, odd billion dollars, which means that for a 5-day working week, you need $1 billion every day to enable that transition. Now, I'm exaggerating that a little bit because obviously a lot of these investments will be backloaded, not front-loaded. But that is the scale of the challenge and the opportunity. And maybe that's where we need to focus our strengths on. Just to add a little bit on the financing part. So earlier it was mentioned that we can look at EXIM banks, export-import banks, for financing transition in India. We were looking at some numbers, and we looked at top 10 global pension funds, patient capital providers, top 10 by AUM, and only 2 of them are active in India. So there is a lot of potential to activate these investments, which could actually help transition India in a much faster manner.
Thank you very much, Shantanu. And with that, this is a wrap. Hopefully you have enjoyed as much as we have. 3 perhaps key messages on the one side, the size of the effort, and we heard about the need to triple the effort, the need to combine different solutions and technologies, what we have today, new technologies, and the need for financing and infrastructure. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the session.
Ladies and gentlemen, with this we end the session. We thank our distinguished panelists for an insightful session. I kindly request all the speakers to gather for a group photograph, please.